A huge move for the San Francisco Giants could be imminent, as one report reveals a major update involving the search for the San Francisco Giants' new manager. Could they have found the guy? We are going to break all of that down here on SF Giants Digest. But before we get into it, make sure to go down below and comment who do you think will be the next manager of the San Francisco Giants? Do you think it'll be Nick Hundley, Tony Vitello, Ron Wotus, Mark DeRosa? Who do you think is going to be at the top step of the dugout when the 2026 season begins? Now, getting right into the discussion, as I mentioned, there was one report that kind of started the ball with who could be the next manager. Getting right into it, Andrew Baggarly, who is one of the beat writers covering the San Francisco Giants for The Athletic, put out an article last night, saying Nick Hundley emerging as the front runner in the Giants' managerial search. Now, immediately, this makes a lot of sense. Hundley is a guy who played for the Giants. He spent 2 years as the backup to Buster Posey, and as we all know, catchers tend to make the best managers. Bob Melvin was a catcher. Bruce Bochy was a catcher. Stephen Vogt, who has had a lot of success in Cleveland in a short time, was a catcher. So this does make a lot of sense for a number of reasons. Now, in the article, this is what Baggarly goes on to say. He says, now Posey is calling the shots. He's in the process of selecting the Giants' next manager. Based on how the process has played out thus far, some folks inside and outside the organization will be surprised if Posey chooses anyone other than Hundley to bring his leadership to the Giants' dugout. Hundley, who currently works as a special assistant to the Texas Rangers general manager Chris Young, has gone through multiple rounds of interviews already. So we've only got two guys that have interviewed officially, which is Kurt Suzuki and then now Nick Hundley. And we see that Nick Hundley has gone through multiple rounds of interviews. He goes on to say there is still time in the process for another candidate to emerge, but it's becoming a widely held expectation that the job is Hundley's if he is ready to accept it. Now, this is huge. We've gotten a lot of, possibilities, speculations about who the next Giants manager could be, but this is the first concrete evidence that we've gotten that there is a leader in this race. There's an emerging candidate that looks like he could be the next manager for the Giants, and that is Nick Hundley. Obviously, like I said, Hundley spent 2 seasons with the Giants as the backup to Posey, and from both sides, from Buster Posey and from Nick Hundley, it sounds like that was a really good relationship between the two. Here, these are both quotes from that article from Andrew Baggarly. Buster Posey, speaking on Nick Hundley, said, "Nick is one of my all-time favorite teammates and one of my best friends," Posey said in spring 2019. "I think that he brings so much on a daily basis. We would love to have him back for sure." Now, Hundley on Buster Posey. "I've caught with a lot of guys, been really fortunate to catch with a lot of great teammates, but as far as teammates go, he might be the best one I've ever had," Hundley said of Posey in 2019. So this goes back to the year right after Nick Hundley left the Giants to go to the A's for his last season in Major League Baseball, and clearly you see here that the two catchers had a very good relationship back in their playing days. In Andrew Baggarly's article, he starts off by saying that when Nick Hundley went to the Giants, it was his first role in Major League Baseball where he was not the starting guy. Throughout the majority of his career up until that point, he had been the primary catcher on a team, but when he came to the Giants, obviously he was not starting over Buster Posey, who was a future Hall of Famer, so he had to learn to take a step back and be a better teammate, do the little things right as a backup catcher where defense is a big thing and then maybe a couple of home runs here and there. He did have 10 home runs in a season with the Giants, which is pretty cool, but he goes in depth about how Nick Hundley prepared for those 2 seasons with the Giants. Like I said, it is not something he hadn't done before in his career, and he took it to heart and really nailed down the little things in his preparation as a backup catcher. Now, this is something that Buster Posey clearly likes. Seeing Nick Hundley work firsthand back as a player, he saw him do the little things, and in a few press conferences since the managerial search has begun, Buster Posey has been pretty outspoken about the fact that he wants a manager who is going to really dive into the little things. Sounds a lot like Gabe Kapler's staff, as Alex Pavlovich has talked about. We've talked about here a little bit, but Gabe Kapler and his staff was doing everything to give the Giants the littlest advantage, from platoon partners to just shifts, all of that stuff. They were staying in hotels just because they were at the ballpark so late and so early to help give the Giants advantages. So Buster Posey have seen Nick Hundley do stuff like this firsthand when he was preparing to be a backup catcher for the first time in his career. And that shows a lot. Maybe a guy who had been a starting catcher for the majority of his career would be like, oh, I'm just going to be a backup. I can kind of cruise through this offseason and just come into spring training, not have a lot of expectations just because I'm the backup. But Posey saw Nick Hundley saying, no, I'm gonna become the best backup catcher that I can be and really help this team win, even though those Giants teams were not very good, if we're being honest. Now, moving on, this is what I had to say about the managerial search for justbaseball.com just yesterday, talking about Nick Hundley. I said the reported favorite for the job, Hundley has always fit the mold of a future manager and is currently in an advisor role with the Texas Rangers. San Francisco was extremely interested in him the last time they had an opening in 2023, but he declined to interview for the position. However, Hundley seems a bit more open to it this time around, as he has reportedly already interviewed for the job. And now we have learned he has gone through multiple rounds of interviews for the job, according to Andrew Baggerly. I went on to say catchers have always been seen as potential candidates to lead a ball club, and Hundley is a guy who did it for 12 years at the game's highest level. He also was the backup to Posey himself for 2 seasons with the Giants towards the end of his career. And then I said, this seems like the most likely ending at this point, but there are certainly others in the mix. And Andrew Baggerly's article almost all but confirms this, that this does seem to be where the ship is heading. Now, obviously, I'm not a reporter. This was just speculation by me, a kind of a prediction of a sort. But I said this seems like the most likely ending at this point because of all the candidates we have heard, through reporters, through MLB Network, all these big name outlets that have reported different guys with the Giants, obviously Kurt Suzuki interviewing. The one guy that I kept going back to that made the most sense was Nick Hundley, a former catcher, a teammate with Buster Posey, so Posey's seen him firsthand, a guy that did the little things right and has been known as just a great guy throughout Major League Baseball who prepared in a major way just for the littlest of jobs. Now, a big thing here that I mentioned was the Giants were really interested in Nick Hundley the last time they did an opening before hiring Bob Melvin, but he declined to interview for the position. Now, this is something that Giants fans turned to early on in the managerial search to say, well, if he wasn't interested in 2023, why would he be interested now? And kind of going off of this, Baggerly in the article does talk about this. He says, Hundley, 42, lives near San Diego with his wife Amy and 2 young daughters. Goes on to say 2 years ago, before the Giants hired manager Bob Melvin, Hundley cited his family situation and his contentment working for Jung when he turned down the invitation to interview for the position. He goes on to talk about some of the charitable stuff that Hundley does as another thing that kind of keeps his time up. But here you see that it was indeed his family situation, his living situation, and how much he enjoyed working for Jung over in Texas for being the reason he had no interest in coming to the Giants. But I do think there's another reason that isn't mentioned here that Jeff Young kind of touches on in this tweet. So he says some SF Giants managerial notes from Robert Murray of the Baseball Insiders podcast earlier today. And the first one that I think is arguably the biggest reason why Hundley didn't want the job 2023 and why he might want it now is this job is significantly more attractive than it was in 2023. The industry views Buster Posey as a good leader, and that is because Buster Posey has convinced this front office to spend a little bit more money. Farhan Zaidi was never the guy to go for the big swing, not to take a lot of risk. He was going to go with the safer bet for the majority of the time. But Buster Posey is seen as a guy who wants to win. He wants to win immediately and is going to do whatever it takes to win. We saw that when he went and got Rafael Devers, signed Willy Adames immediately after getting the job as the president of baseball operations. He's a guy that is going to put the organization in the best spot to win at the end of the day. And I think this is the biggest reason why Nick Hundley did not want this job back in 2023. Back then, heading into 2024, there wasn't a ton of excitement involving the Giants. You hadn't made the playoffs since 2021, and even then, before that, it had been all the way since 2016. So a big spell of playoff baseball. Not a ton of exciting names on the roster. Obviously, they went on to sign Matt Chapman, Blake Snell, Jorge Soler, Jung Hoo Lee, but none of those guys were there when they were searching for that manager. So that job was a lot less attractive. There also wasn't a ton of young talent on the Giants at that time. Marco Luciano was still a ways away, Luis Matos, some of these names that we've talked about for a while now. Back then, they weren't as highly touted. They weren't big league ready, which you could argue some of them still aren't. But this job is significantly more attractive now. You have Willy Adames, you have Rafael Devers, you have Matt Chapman, you have these, superstars or stars that you can pencil into your lineup every day, and you know that just having those guys alone, you'll have a chance to win. And then thinking about Logan Webb at the top of your rotation, who you know is going to give you 6 or 7 innings every 5th day. A guy like Robbie Ray as the number 2, who was just an all-star, and then young guys, Landon Roop, Carson Wisman, who's a top prospect. And then you add to the fact that Buster Posey is a guy who's going to go out and spend some money in free agency to add some pitching, help the bullpen out. This is a very attractive job, in my opinion. So I do think that is the biggest reason for Nick Hundley wanting to, go through a couple rounds of interviews this time and really considering the job. Whereas in 2023, he did decline the interview. Obviously, the family stuff is very important. Based on how ex-teammates talk about Nick Hundley as a teammate, I would only assume that he is a great father, a great family person. So that is definitely a big part of it. But I do think the fact that this Giants team has a lot more excitement heading into 2026 as compared to going into 2024. I do think that is a big part of this managerial search. Now, that is going to do it for this video of SF Giants Digest. Make sure before we finish out here, you go down below, hit the subscribe button, join the community, and get notified of all future uploads. And as always, go Giants!